Jenny Thomas Handy of General Marshall's staff at the War Department were on Harding. Cook recorded that as Harding closed the beach, we saw an LCT dash in opposite a draw, firing her guns at some German position at Colleville. The German batteries were hidden in the shrubbery, had the advantage, and the LCT was badly shot up. So were many others. The Navy report for the transport group carrying the 18th ashore listed 22 LCVPs, 2 LCIs, and 4 LCTs as lost at the beach, either to mined obstacles or to enemy artillery fire. Sergeant Hyman Haas was lucky. LCTs to the right and left of his were burning. The machine gun fire was right into them. Mortars were blowing around them. Artillery pieces were blowing beside them. But we had landed in a spot that seemed to be immune. Haas commanded a half-track, M15. When he drove off the LCT, the water reached up to my neck. My driver, Bill Hendricks, had his head just above water. We kept going. Some screwball gave a rebel yell. Sergeant Chester Gutowski looked at him and growled, "You schmuck, why don't you shut up?" When Haas reached shore, I was breathing very heavily with excitement, eyes darting in all directions, looking, waiting, seeing. It was quite bewildering. He started thinking straight immediately. Haas ordered Hendricks to drive back into the water, then to turn the M15 into firing position. He began to blaze away with his 37mm gun, aiming at a pillbox on the west side of the E1 exit. The first 3 rounds were short. He adjusted his range setter and, the next 10 shots went directly into the porthole of the pillbox. With that kind of support, the 18th got ashore, but not without loss and not without confusion, a confusion compounded by the mislanding of the 115th Regiment of the 29th Division, which was supposed to land on Dog Red, but instead came in starting at 10:30 on Easy Red, right on top of the 18th. This caused a horrendous mix-up of men and units and imposed delays, but it put a lot of firepower on Easy Red, where it was badly needed. As the 18th came ashore, it appeared to the officers that no progress at all had been made. The regimental action report declared, "The beach shingle was full of tractors, tanks, vehicles, bulldozers and troops. The high ground was still held by Germans, who had all troops on the beach pinned down. The beach was still under heavy fire from enemy small arms, mortars and artillery. Captain Al Smith was executive officer, 1st Battalion, 16th Regiment. He had landed on Easy Red at 07:45. About 500 yards offshore I began to realise we were in trouble," he recalled. "The nearer we got to the beach line, the more certain I was that the landing was a disaster. Dead and wounded from the first waves were everywhere. There was little or no firing from our troops. On the other hand, German machine guns, mortars and 88s were laying down some of the heaviest fire I'd ever experienced. About half of Smith's battalion made it to the defilade afforded by the shingle embankment. Smith made contact with Brig, Genon Willard Wyman, the assistant division commander. Wyman asked if the men were advancing by fire and movement, as taught at the infantry school. "Yes, sir," Smith snapped back. "They're firing. We're moving." He followed the path made earlier that morning by Captain Dawson of G Company up the bluff. Near the top I can recall the most pleasant 5-minute break of my military career. With our column at one of its temporary standstills, Hank and I moved to the side to sit down and eat apples provided by the ship's mess. We also had time for a wee nip of Scotch whisky, my farewell gift from a little old English lady. Smith set up the battalion CP beside a dirt road. About this time a telephone line reached me from Regimental HQ at the base of the bluffs. Colonel Taylor asked about our situation and what he could do to help. I told him we could use tanks. The sooner, the better. He promised to do everything possible. It was 11 Najor. Taylor ordered all tanks available to go into action up the E3 draw. Cap W.M. King got the order. He ran along the beach, notifying each tank as he came to it to proceed to E3 and move up. When he reached the last tank, King found the commander wounded. He took over. Backing away from the shingle, King drove east, weaving in and out of the wreckage along the beach. He made about 200 metres when he hit a mine that blew the centre bogie assembly off and broke the track. He went on to the exit on foot, where he found that, of the handful of tanks that had started for E3, only 3 had arrived. 2 of these were knocked out as they tried to force their way up the draw. The third backed off. E3 was not yet open. PVT Ray Moon of the 116th reached the top about this time. I looked back at the beach. The view was unforgettable. The beach was a shooting gallery for machine gunners. The scene below reminded me of the Chicago stockyard cattle pens and its slaughterhouse. We could see the men in the water and those huddled along the sea wall. There was little movement, and all those below were sitting ducks for any trained marksmen and artillery observers. Mortar fire, artillery shells, and machine gun fire continued to rain down on the beach. At higher HQ, Easy Red continued to look like a calamity. Gero reported to Bradley. Situation beach exits. Easy still critical at 11 Axi, 352nd Infantry Division, German. Identified fighting continuous on beaches. But on the spot, things looked better. Colonel Talley of the Forward Information Detachment reported shortly after 11 War. Infiltration approximately platoon strength up draw midway between exits E1 and Easy 3. And a bit later, men advancing up slope behind Easy Red, men believed ours on skyline. One of those GIs on the skyline was Capt. Joe Dawson of G Company. How he got there is a story he tells best himself. On landing, I found total chaos as men and material were literally choking the sandbar just at the water's edge. A minefield lay in and around a path extending to my right and upward to the crest of the bluff. After blowing a gap in the concertina wire, I led my men gingerly over the body of a soldier who had stepped on a mine in seeking to clear the path. I collected my company at the base of the bluff and proceeded on. Midway toward the crest, I met Lieutenant Spaulding. I proceeded toward the crest, asking Spaulding to cover me. Near the crest, the terrain became almost vertical. This afforded complete defilade from the entrenched enemy above. A machine gun nest was busily firing at the beach, and one could hear rifle and mortar fire coming from the crest. I tossed 2 grenades aloft, and when they exploded, the machine gun fell silent. I waved my men and Spaulding to proceed as rapidly as possible, and I then proceeded to the crest, where I saw the enemy moving out toward the E3 exit and the dead Germans in the trenches. To my knowledge, no one had penetrated the enemy defences until that moment. As soon as my men reached me, we debouched from that point, firing on the retreating enemy and moving toward a wooded area, and this became a battleground extending all the way into town. In an analysis of how he became the first American to reach the top of the bluff in this area, written in 1993, Dawson pointed out, "The Battle of Omaha Beach was first, deadly enemy fire on an exposed beach where total fire control favoured the defender, and we were not given any direct fire support from the Navy or tanks. Second, the poor German marksmanship is the only way I could have made it across the exposed area, because I could not engage the enemy, nor even see him until I reached the machine gun. Third, the fortunate ability to control my command, both in landing together and debouching up the bluff together as a fighting unit. Fourth, our direct engagement of the enemy caused him to cease concerted small arms, machine gun and mortar fire, with which he was sweeping the beach below. While Dawson moved on Colleville, Spaulding went to the right, towards Saint-Laurent. Spaulding spread his men over an area of some 300 metres and advanced. They spotted a German machine gunner with a rifleman on each side of him, firing down on the beach from their dugout. Sergeant Stretzik shot the gunner in the back. The rifleman surrendered. Spaulding interrogated the prisoners, but they were ethnic Germans and refused to give any information. With the prisoners in tow, Spaulding moved west. We were now in hedgerows and orchard country, he told Sergeant Forrest Pogue of the Army's Historical Division in a February 1945 interview. We crossed through 2 minefields. No one was lost. We still had an angel on each shoulder. The E Company platoon came upon a fortified position overlooking the E1 draw. Sergeant Kenneth Peterson fired his bazooka into it, but no one came out. Spalding was about to move on when he spied a Tobruk. Sergeant Stretzick and I went forward to investigate. We discovered an underground dugout. There was an 81mm mortar with beautiful range cards and lots of ammunition, and a position for a 75mm cannon, overlooking E1 draw. The dugout was of cement, had radios, excellent sleeping facilities, dogs. We started to drop a grenade in the ventilator, but Stretchick said, "Hold on a minute," and fired 3 shots down the steps into the dugout. He then yelled in Polish and German for them to come out. 4 men did. They brought out 2 or 3 wounded. Germans from the other side of the draw began to fire on Spalding's platoon. The GIs fired back. American destroyers commenced firing into the draw. Spalding started down the line of communication trenches, which led to the cliff overlooking the beach. We were now behind the Germans, so we routed 4 out of a hole and got 13 in the trenches. The trenches had telemines, hundreds of grenades, numerous machine guns. Spalding inspected the trenches. There, he admitted, I did a fool thing. He had lost his carbine when he landed, had picked up a German rifle only to discover he did not know how to use it, and had traded it to a soldier for another carbine. But he failed to check the carbine. In the trenches, I ran into a kraut and pulled the trigger, but the safety was on. I reached for the safety catch and hit the clip release, so my clip hit the ground. I ran about 50 yards in nothing flat. Fortunately, Sergeant Peterson had me covered and the German put up his hands. That business of not checking guns is certainly not habit-forming. Spalding tried to use the 81mm mortar, but no one in his platoon could operate the German weapon. Meanwhile, he sent 19 German prisoners back to the beach, guarded by 2 of his men. He told the men to turn the prisoners over to anyone who would take them and to ask where the rest of E Company was located. He set off his last yellow smoke grenade to let the American destroyers know that he had possession of the fortification, because their fire was getting very close. At this point, about 10:30, Lieutenant Hutch and 9 enlisted men caught up with Spalding. I was very glad to see them, Spalding told Pogue. Hutch brought word that Spalding should change his objective from Saint-Laurent to Colville, that is, head east instead of trying to cross the E1 draw. The terrain was flat, an area of apple orchards and hedgerows. Germans from the 352nd Division were present in company strength. The fighting now took on a new form. Instead of firing on the beach from the extensive trench system on the bluff, the Germans were hidden in hedgerows. Their main weapon was the fearfully effective MG-42. They had clear fields of fire over the open fields. The inexperienced GIs found it difficult to locate enemy fire positions in terrain affording so much cover, a difficulty exacerbated by sniper fire coming from no one could tell where. With no mortars, tanks, or supporting artillery, and with inadequate communications with the destroyers, the American infantrymen could advance hardly at all. Again and again, the E Company platoon ran into pockets of resistance in prepared positions built around machine guns dug in along the hedgerows. When Spalding and Hutch bypassed such positions, the platoon got split up, so there was progressive loss of control. Still, they managed to move forward and catch up with and join Captain Dawson and G Company. Dawson was experiencing similar difficulties in moving on Colleville. Dawson led by example and gave orders that were simple, direct, impossible not to understand. I said, "Men, there is the enemy. Let's go get them." Company G worked its way to within a kilometre of Colleville. Dawson paused under a large oak tree. There, a very friendly French woman welcomed us with open arms and said, "Welcome to France." Dawson advanced to the edge of Colleville. The dominant building, as always in the Normandy villages, was a Norman church built of stone, its steeple stretching into the sky. Sure enough, Dawson noted, in the steeple of the church there was an artillery observer. He dashed inside the church with a sergeant and a private. Immediately, 3 Germans inside the church opened fire. Fortunately, we were not hit by this burst. But as we made our way through the church, the private was killed, shot by the observer in the tower. I turned, and we secured the tower by eliminating him. My sergeant shot the other 2 Germans, and thus we took care of the opposition at that point. As Dawson ran out of the church, a German rifleman shot at him. Dawson fired back with his carbine, but not before the German got off a second shot. The bullet went through Dawson's carbine and shattered the stock. Fragments from the bullet went through his kneecap and leg, which caused my knee to swell and caused me to be evacuated the next day. Beyond the church, G Company ran into heavy fire from a full German company occupying the houses in Colleville. Built of stone, the positions were all but impregnable to small arms fire. G Company got into what Dawson called a very severe firefight, but could not advance. It was shortly after noon. Margin William Washington, executive officer of the 2nd Battalion, 16th Regiment, came up, arriving at about the same time as Spaulding's platoon. Washington set up a CP in a drainage ditch just west of Colleville. He sent the E Company platoon to the right of the village. Spaulding moved out and got separated from Dawson. Germans moved into the gap. In 40 minutes, Spaulding's platoon was surrounded. Just that quickly, Spaulding realized that instead of attacking, he was being counter-attacked. He set up a defensive position in the drainage ditches. Several squads of Germans came toward the platoon. Spaulding's men were able to beat them off. Spaulding saw a runner coming from the battalion CP with a message from Major Washington. The Germans opened fire on him. After he fell, they fired at least 100 rounds of machine gun ammunition into him. It was terrible, but we do the same thing when we want to stop a runner bearing information. Spaulding's platoon spent the remainder of the day in the ditches, fighting a defensive action. By nightfall, Spaulding was down to 6 rounds of carbine ammunition. Most of his men were down to their last clip. The platoon was still surrounded. It had been the first platoon to take prisoners. It had eliminated several machine gun posts on the bluff, and the Tobruk looking down the E1 draw. It had landed with 30 men. By nightfall, 2 had been killed, 7 wounded. 5 men in the platoon were awarded DSCs, personally presented by General Eisenhower. They were Lieutenant John Spaulding, Kentucky; Sergeant Philip Strexick, New Jersey; Pitt Richard Gallagher, New York; Pitt George Bowen, Kentucky; Sergeant Kenneth Peterson, New Jersey. Major Washington dug in, expecting a major German tank counterattack, as he had experienced in Sicily. We spent all night of the first day wrestling 57mm anti-tank weapons up the cliff, with ropes, with jeeps and winches and everything else. By daylight, June 7th, there had been no counterattack. What Washington did see at first light was astonishing enough. 2 GIs leading 50 German prisoners of war into the American line. The Americans turned out to be privates who had been mislanded and captured by the Germans. Both American privates were of Polish extraction. The German soldiers were Polish conscripts. When darkness fell, the GIs persuaded their captors to hide out in the bushes and surrender at first light. Casualties in the Easy Red sector were awful. In F Company, 16th Regiment, every officer and more than half the NCOs were down by the end of the day. The losses in the other platoons of E Company were almost as heavy. The carnage made an indelible impression on the S3, Captain Fred Hall. He concluded his oral history with these words: "My wife and I walked Easy Red Beach in May 1982. It was soon enough to return." Spaulding fought on through the campaign in northwest Europe. He continued to provide inspired leadership, and, as he told Pogue in the 1945 interview, he learned a lot about combat in the process that he wished he had known on D-Day. He was lucky, he said. Most survivors from Easy Red have a Lord was I lucky story to tell. Sergeant John Ellery recalled that in the fighting outside Colleville, "I was about to climb through a break in the hedgerow when my ID bracelet on my right wrist got hung up on a rather sturdy piece of brush. I slid back down and broke off the branch to get loose. Meanwhile, a fellow from another company decided to pass by me and go on over. As his head cleared the top of the hedgerow, he took a round right in the face and fell back on top of me, dead." Ellery went looking for the sniper. I evened the score. It was a clean shot, and the only one that I fired on D-Day. Ellery decided that he was hungry. He thought one of his apples would taste good. He dug around in his musette bag and discovered that my apples had become applesauce. So I settled for a K ration and enjoyed it. I enjoyed it so much that I decided to have another. It seemed to me that I wasn't likely to outlast my supply of rations, so there was no point in going hungry. The sight of Americans on the bluff and the procession of prisoners coming down with their hands over their heads gave heart to the men on the beach and to the generals on Ancon and Augusta. But at 12 Hog, Easy Red was by no means a safe place to be. The machine gun fire had let up in the area between E3 and E1, thanks to the platoons that had gone up the bluff, eliminating pillboxes as they climbed, but the mortar and artillery fire continued to pour down, not as accurate as it had been earlier, because forward observation posts had been overrun or destroyed, but in greater volume. Reinforcements were coming ashore, primarily from the 115th Regiment. Its 1st Battalion, combat-loaded in LCVPs, went in at 11 Saumur side by side with, or immediately behind, the craft carrying the 18th Regiment ashore. But at 12 Cairns, the other 2 battalions of the 18th, loaded in LCIs, were still milling about the line of departure. It was an hour after high water, and the ebb was running so fast it was difficult for the LCIs to avoid stranding, so they discharged their troops into LCVPs, which shuttled between them and the shore. The Germans caught on to this and started hitting the transfer points with shells. LCI 490 was unable to hook up with any LCVPs, but the skipper did spot an LCM. He traded his load of troops for the LCM's unwanted load of high explosives, to which he promptly gave the Deep Six. Pet Eldon Weehee was a truck driver for HQ Battery, 1st Division Artillery. His LCT, carrying 7 deuce-and-a-half trucks loaded with ammunition, was scheduled to go in at 8:30, but at 11:30 it was still circling offshore, out of range of the German guns. When it did turn toward shore, an LCT to the right got hit by an 88mm shell, so the skipper on Weehee's LCT turned around and headed back into the channel. After a bit, he headed toward shore again, came under heavy gunfire, and backed off once more. At 1200, a patrol craft came by, and a control officer with a bullhorn yelled, "The skipper of that craft, take that craft in. You've been in twice and backed off twice. Now take it in this time and do not come back until it is unloaded." The tide was receding, but still high enough to cover the obstacles. Shells were exploding around the LCT. The skipper got in as far as he was going to go that day and, still well offshore, lowered the ramp. Weehee's lieutenant protested, "Take us in closer." "Get off," the skipper replied. The first truck drove off and immediately sank, the water far above the exhaust pipe. "Take us in closer," the lieutenant screamed at the skipper. "Get off," the skipper replied. "I've got to unload and get back to sea." One after the other, the remaining 6 trucks drove off and sank. The drivers climbed out, inflated their May Wests, and swam in to shore. As he got out of the water, Weehee heard a shell coming in. He jumped into a shell hole. "When that shell burst," he related, "I panicked. I started crying. My buddies got me behind a burned-out craft, where I cried for what seemed like hours. I cried until tears would no longer come. I stopped crying and came to my senses. There were pillboxes off to Weehee's left, at the opening of E3 draw, firing down the beach. He saw 2 bulldozers head for the positions, blades down. The dozers piled sand on the pillboxes and put them out of action. On the return trip to the beach, one of the dozers took a direct hit. The man on it seemed like he flew all to pieces. Weehee and the other drivers in his group picked up rifles and carbines and became infantry. "We loaded up and moved forward," Weehee said. In concluding his oral history, Weehee recalled his crying episode and declared, "To this day I've never shed another tear. I would give anything to have one good cry or one good laugh. I hurt inside, but I cannot get my emotions out since that day. I've never been able to. By 12 AG, Americans from the 16th, 18th, 115th and 116th Regiments had been coming ashore at Easy Red for 5.5 hours. They had made no gains at E3 draw. The traffic jam was still horrendous. Dead and wounded were strewn about the beach and behind the seawall. But what looked like catastrophe wasn't. Although the situation was far from being well in hand, it was improving, especially at E1. Thanks to Spaulding and Dawson, the fortification on the east side of the draw had been neutralised. The fortification on the west side was still in action, but was being contained by Company M, 116th Regiment. Dozers had made a gap through the dune line just east of the draw, and were making it ready for vehicles to pass through. Best of all, a penetration had been made almost exactly between E1 and E3 by companies E, I and G of the 16th Regiment, and Colleville was under attack. To the right, 5 companies from the 116th had gone up the bluff between D3 and E1, while to the left of E3 patrols from 3 companies of the 16th had done the same. At 13:09, Gero was able to make his first favourable report to Bradley. Troops formally pinned down on beaches Easy Red, Easy Green, Fox Red, advancing up heights behind beaches. The situation everywhere on the beach was still grave, Bradley later wrote, but our troops were inching inland. I gave up any thought of abandoning Omaha Beach. Major General Charles Gerhardt, K.O. of the 29th Division, later wrote a report entitled Battle Lessons and Conclusions on D-Day. He summarised the lessons learned in 2 sentences. No reports of disaster should be allowed. They are never true.